Welcome to Swayam MOOC on British Poetry and Drama. I'm Dr. Vandana Rajoriya and I'm really delighted to be with you all again. Today, we turn to sonnet number 1 of Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophil and Stella. In our previous lectures, we journeyed through Chaucer's Wife of Bath's prologue. We saw how Chaucer's poetry reminded us that English poetry could be deeply humane and artistically unique and personal. Chaucer's rhythm, Chaucer's characterization and all was really amazing. From Chaucer's world, today we move to Sir Philip Sidney's world. Now, when you look at English Renaissance, then you realize that there is something deeply Greek about it. The sonnet which we will be taking up today is a sonnet which comes from Sidney's sonnet sequence Astrophil and Stella. Stella in Greek means star and Astrophil means star lover. There is something Greek about the poem we are going to take up today. But then wait, let us take up a moment. The poem begins somewhere in ancient Greece in spirits. Greeks used to believe that Zeus had 9 daughters with goddess of memory, and these 9 daughters guided art and artists in this world. In fact, without the muses, artists themselves were nothing. And it is at this interface of Greek art and English Renaissance that we meet Sir Philip Sidney today. Like Chaucer, Sidney helped shape English verse, but his voice is different, more personal, more introspective. Today's poem is not a dramatic tale nor a grand metaphysical argument. It is a confession, a young man's struggle to find his true voice in the world of borrowed eloquence. And so we begin with sonnet number 1 of Astrophil and Stella, a poem that dramatizes the very act of poetic creation, a poem where after much striving and self-doubt, the muse finally speaks the words that guide Sidney and perhaps guide us too. Fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write. Today, we will listen to that voice. In Wife of Bath's prologue, we witness Chaucer's genius as a poet, a master of storytelling, vivid characterization, rhythm and irony. Chaucer showed us that English poetry could be deeply human and artistically vivid. From Chaucer's world, when we move to Philip Sidney's world, basically our world expands. Sidney, a courtier, a poet, a lover, inspires many thoughts into us. Often we wonder what goes into the body of a true poem. And often we struggle why words are insufficient to answer feelings and express our thoughts. It is at this junction that we meet Sidney in this poem. But let us take a moment, because this poem in spirit begins somewhere in ancient Greece. The ancient Greeks believed poets were not merely clever craftsmen, they were vessels of something greater. They spoke of the muses, those radiant daughters of Zeus and the goddess of memory, 9 sisters dancing upon mountain tops, whispering to poets as they dreamed beneath the stars. Each muse, they believed, guided an art. Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, Erato, the muse of love poetry, and so on. Without the muse's whisper, even the brightest mind stood silent. Sir Philip Sidney, the poet before us today, stands at the meeting point of this ancient faith in inspiration and the blossoming of English poetry. In this sonnet sequence, and specifically in this sonnet, Sidney asks those questions which have been bothering us even today. Questions like why words falter, what it takes to write a truly inspiring poem. So, the poem which we will take up today is Sidney's not exactly an answer, but a speculation on this poem. But before we begin with the discussions of the poem, let us first look at the learning objectives of today's session. Understand the narrative arc and emotional structure of Sonnet 1, identify key themes, poetic inspiration, unfulfilled desire, imitation versus authenticity. Explore Sidney's reaction to patriarchal conventions, understand how he both inherits and challenges them, and analyze the poem's use of literary devices like metaphor, irony and classical allusions. We also will be able to reflect on how Sidney's crisis of voice anticipates later struggles in English poetry with form, originality and emotional truth. We will move step by step. We will begin our session with a close reading of sonnet number 1 of Sidney's sonnet sequence to understand rhythm, form, feeling and get the feel of the entire poem. It will be followed by a discussion on form and structure of the poem. Then we will take up line by line analysis of the poem to understand the spirit of the poem. Then we will be looking into the chief literary devices and figures of speech which grant the poem its unique magic. We will understand mythological influences and their role in Sidney's sonnet. We will also look at the thematic concerns and other important dimensions of the poem. So, grab your pen and paper. As we read this sonnet, look at the sonnet, read with me with passion and power, try to feel the rhythm, notice the sound pattern, syllables, and after the session, let us talk about it and let us reflect upon what are its implications. Sonnet number 1 from Astrophil and Stella. Loving in truth and fain in my verse my love to show, that she, dear she, might take some pleasure of my pain. Pleasure might cause her read, reading might make her know, knowledge might pity win, and pity grace obtain. I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe, studying inventions fine, her wits to entertain, oft turning others' leaves to see if thence would flow some fresh and fruitful showers upon my sunburned brain. But words came halting forth, wanting invention's stay. Invention, nature's child, fled step dame study rose, and others' feet still seemed but strangers in my way. Thus, great with chide to speak, and helpless in my throes, biting my treven pen, beating myself for pride. Fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write. Notice the magic of words here. It's like a chain of reactions which Sidney talks about, and all these reactions, they basically are guided towards a problem and a solution, not a probable solution, but then yes, a reflection on the problem. Now, this is where Petrarchan convention of sonnet writing comes into picture. We know that this is a sonnet. Sonnet is a poem of 14 lines, and here Sidney does this sonnet for us in line with the original Petrarchan tradition, where we find that sonnets are done in octave and sestet form. While octave proposes a problem, sestet offers solution to it. And Sidney's twist to this Petrarchan convention is that he brings in volta. He does not offer a clear resolution to the poem, rather he makes us reflect upon it and passes some comments which go a long way in enhancing our understanding of the whole idea. Now, when you look at the structure and form of this poem, then you notice that rhyme, rhythm, meter, everything has been carefully designed in such a way that it makes you identify and feel the tension which is there in the heart of the poet and the lover. He is struggling to answer a question. What is the question? When you look at the octave initial lines, 8 lines, they tell us that the question is how to write a poem or how to outpour your emotions on paper in such a way, how to paint love on papers in such a way that the beloved, when she reads it, she offers affection, she reciprocates the love. Now, there is a lot which the poem makes us reflect upon and think. Because what is happening? Why the poet is struggling? Because he feels that somehow language is inadequate. Somehow it is very difficult to find words, correct words that reach the heart the way that you do get the desired results from it. Now, let us look at the poem again, line by line. Let us closely analyze, look for the, hidden suggested meaning in the poem, because poem, as much as it is in the line, more than that it is between the lines. Let us look at the first 4 lines of the sonnet. Loving in truth and fain in verse my love to show. So the very opening lines of the poem, loving in truth and fain in verse my love to show, they make us understand 2 things. Immediately, the lover, and Sidney as lover here, he places himself as a truthful lover, and he brings in his struggle into picture. And what is the struggle? How to paint truthfully this love in words on paper. So he says, loving in truth and fain in verse my love to show. He gladly wishes that these words show his true feeling to the beloved, that she, dear she. This repetition of dear she makes you feel how much of love and affection he feels for the lady love. We understand that this love is unreciprocated. Star, the idea of Stella, the name star itself is a reminder that the beloved is distant, somehow beyond reach, not achievable. Yet look at the fondness in the heart of the poet. There is no feeling of bitterness, no feeling of anger, just fond wish that somehow she understands and responds. So he says, loving in truth and fain in verse my love to show, that she, dear she, might take some pleasure of my pain. This is interesting. He says, might take some pleasure of my pain. So here art doesn't lead to pain, rather it leads to pleasure. So he doesn't look forward to beloved feeling regret, beloved feeling sadness. This is a poem where Sidney is basically, highlighting how much pain he is in and how much fondly he wishes, deeply he wishes that his lady love understands this love and comes to him. But then, she doesn't respond, but still there is no regret. There is no sadness in it, and he doesn't look forward to making her sad. He rather says that this reading his poem makes her feel pleasure. And then, like a scientist, when she'll feel pleasure, then it will lead to a chain of reactions. What reactions? Next line tells us. So he says, loving in truth and fain in verse my love to show, that she, dear she, might take some pleasure of my pain. Pleasure might cause her read, reading might make her know, knowledge might pity win, and pity grace obtain. So what he looks forward to is that I should write such a poem in such lines that when she reads it, she feels pleasure out of it. And this pleasure causes her to read it full, so that reading would make her know. Now we all know that the words here go far beyond the immediate context of the poem. We do understand that these are all linked. When is it that we will pursue knowledge? How is it that we are going to read? Basically, the whole idea is simple. It is only when we derive pleasure in the process of reading that we read more, and it is only reading more that would bring knowledge to us. Now, let us look at the poem. Let us get back to the context here. So, here knowledge means understanding. So, he feels that I should write such a poem that she feels pleasure reading it, and when she reads it, she understands my emotions. And when he's sure, when she'll understand the emotions, she'll feel pity for him, she'll feel compassion for him, and if she feels this compassion, then she might offer him the grace of affection which he so fondly longs for. So the initial 4 lines themselves make us understand the truth of the love, what Sidney is trying to do. He's trying to paint true love, and you get a glimpse of the true loves, not in the lines of course, but in between the lines, all that is not said but suggested. Now let us move further. Next 4 lines of the octave. I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe. Now here I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe, studying inventions fine, her wits to entertain, oft turning others' leaves to see if thence would flow some fresh and fruitful showers upon my sunburned brain. Sidney begins with a problem. Problem is how to paint feelings on words that inspire similar feelings. And obviously, to learn the art, he tells us that he turns to books, to poets. So these lines tell us that Sidney somehow is suggesting that I read so many poets, I turned the leaves of so many books, I sought inspiration from all the classical, all the great writers. But then, and when he is doing this, he is hoping that it will make him successful in his endeavor. But the imagery, but the suggested words which he chooses, they suggest that what he is looking for somehow is not coming, and there is a tone of despair when he is writing this. Look at it once again. I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe. Blackest face of woe here means deepest sorrow, the sorrow, deep sorrow which is there in his heart. He looked for words to paint it, and in an effort to be able to paint these words, he studied the previous poets, writers, so that he could get some inspiration from them. He tried to imitate from their art so that he is in a position to appeal to her wits. But there is a frustration in the next line when he says, oft turning others' leaves to see if thence would flow. So that frustration is very much visible because, and then there is a suggestion. He says, some fresh and fruitful sorrows upon my sunburned brain. He weaves a beautiful metaphor, sunburned brain. So it's like he has been trying to soak himself in borrowed sunlight, and his brain is now completely overheated with an effort to, imbibe this inspiration. The despair, the frustration, the gloom is very much visible in these lines. Now, octave has posed a problem in front of us. The problem is that it is difficult to find apt words to paint feelings on papers, and all our attempts, somehow what Sidney suggests that the borrowed art doesn't really help. So when he is looking at the poets, when he is turning the leaves of the poems of other writers, he is trying to borrow art, borrow style, borrow form to be able to achieve his end, but the results are not to his expectations. So octave has positioned Sidney and his problem very powerfully in front of us. In line with the Petrarchan convention, sestet should follow it with a solution. So let us see whether sestet gives us a solution to the problem. Let us read the next lines. But words came halting forth, wanting invention's stay. Invention, nature's child, fled step-dame studies blows, and others' feet still seemed but strangers in my way. Thus great with child to speak and helpless in my throes, biting my driven pen, beating myself for spite. When you look at the sestet, you realize that all reading, all mastering the art, the meter, the rhythm, the form of the previous writers has not truly helped him. Nothing has helped him and his words are faltering. Therefore, he says, but words came halting forth, stumbling awkwardly. Then he says, wanting inventions stay. So, why is it that the words are not coming the way he wants them? Because somehow invention is not there. Now, what is invention here? Invention means true genius, creative genius, and Sidney is trying to highlight here that there is something which is inborn in a poet as a poet. So, you cannot learn the craft of poetry, it has to be there in you. And all this reading, all this effort, all this struggle of mastering the art of the previous poets and writers to his purpose has ultimately failed him, and he is feeling lone, he is feeling left out, he is feeling alienated because none of them he hoped would rescue him, really able to answer him, to be able to help him or rescue him. So, he says, but words came halting forth, wanting inventions stay. So, he highlights here that imagination and true creative genius, they are more important in poetic creation. You just cannot learn the art and craft great poetry out of imitation of others. And then he says, invention, nature's child, fled step dame studies blows. He comes up with a beautiful comparison. He draws a beautiful metaphor where he feels that invention is like a child who is not staying, who is somehow running away. So, invention, which we understand that is creative genius, so somehow he says that the more he tries to read it, the more he tries to grasp it and imbibe it, and the more he is becoming unsuccessful in the art. So, it is like the child who is somehow running away, a child who would not come, would not listen to him. So, somehow true poetic genius, invention has left him. And then, and others' feet still seemed but strangers in my way. So, he feels alienated. All these poets he tried to follow, he was inspired by, they really feel so distant. He does not feel to be reaching anywhere to them with them. Then he says, thus great with child to speak and helpless in my throes, biting my treven pen, beating myself for spite. Now, he brings up another metaphor. Now, here metaphor is that of a woman in child labor. Now, you can understand the metaphor or the intensity of the pain which Sidney feels in it through this metaphor, through this comparison only. So, woman struggling in childbirth, somehow the most painful, but the situation which is very painful, but which actually brings joy, is the situation of Sidney. And then comes the volta, Sidney's way. So, sudden surprise, sudden turning point in the poem. Just when we were anticipating that the poem would end in despair, something happens. What happens? Look at the last lines. Fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write. Notice, fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write. So, somehow muse comes to rescue. So, it is when he feels absolute despair and he is at dead loss that the muse grants him inspiration. And what is it that muse tells us? Look and write. And where to look? Look in thy heart and write. So, the answer which Sidney gives us in this poem is that authenticity is the key. You cannot copy, you cannot imitate others, and then you can do something which is truthful, which is truly genius, which is universal in nature. Great poetry cannot come by imitation. Great poetry comes through authenticity. So, here the answer which Sidney gives through the poem is that we need not look for imitation, we need to look for inspiration from within. And this idea that fool my muse said to me, it connects the poem immediately to the Greeks. Two things which are noticeable in this poem. The very title of the sonnet sequence, Astrophil and Stella, the Greek words, where Astrophil means star lover and Stella means a star, and then this idea of the muses of poetry. Somehow Sidney here paints a whole era in front of us, rather makes us see the flow of time from Greeks to the English. We journey through in this poem that way. This poem thus dramatizes artists' struggle between art, craft and authenticity. And somehow Sidney answers that true poem will not come through imitation, but it will come through art. It reveals Astrophil's anxiety as both a lover and a writer, the fear of inadequacy, the desperate search for the right words, and finally the revelation that true art begins with truth to oneself. Sidney's form mirrors this struggle. The poem uses Alexandrines, the obsessive AB, 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 AB rhyme, and the dramatic shift in the closing couplet all work together to enact the very tension that Astrophil describes. In the end, Astrophil and Stella sonnet number 1 is more than a love poem. It is a poem about poetry itself, about the labor of creation and about the enduring power of writing from the heart. Now that we have looked at the poem in its entirety, reflect upon this. What could be the major thematic concerns here? Obviously, love, truthful love, happens to be one of the thematic concerns in it. But then there is more than that to it. Sidney somehow brings in the idea of imitation and role of inspiration in poetry, in the creative process, in the process of creating art. Then he also brings in paradox of human aspiration. Now look at the paradox in the poem. The poet Astrophil wants to win true love and is trying to showcase true love, but then he is using craft, he is using artificiality to achieve his end, and therefore it is not being fulfilled. When you look at the major thematic concerns of the poem, apart from this, courtly love also becomes one of the thematic concerns, because somehow it is Sidney's take on the poets who were writing in the time, all the courtly poets who were writing artificial poems, not pouring genuine feelings into the heart of the poem. And Sidney somehow highlights here that how artificial, how unnatural and unimpressive the work actually becomes. So we will wind up our discussions of Sidney's Astrophil and Stella sonnets here today. We looked at the sonnet, we did close reading and analysis of the poem line by line. Now in our next session, we will be taking up a study of Edmund Spenser, and we will look at Spenserian sonnet form. In the next session, we will be taking up a detailed survey of the journey of sonnet form, how it got invented in Italy, how it reached from Petrarch to Sidney, Shakespeare, and then finally Spenser. All of these poets who basically adopted the form and made it their own in unique ways, and in that way fashioned the muse of English poetry. So this is all for today. See you in the course. Thank you.